To action is. We can start with panel 2 of the conference on women and markets, and the chair is going to be Elissar Sarrouh, who is a professor of practice here at the Institute. Elissar,
thank you. Good morning, everyone, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the second panel in this conference on women and markets. We opened a discussion this morning on women and markets, addressing the central notion in women's empowerment as the ability to be gainfully and meaningfully employed, to gain financial autonomy, benefit equally from a good education, gain skills, and have access to productive resources such as land and capital. But despite universal agreement that girls' and women's education is of central importance to their well-being and to development itself, the gender gap persists in many places in the world. Despite increases in labor force participation, the glass ceiling remains unbroken, and the job opportunities available to women, who often shoulder the burden of care of the young and the elderly, are often of poor quality and low remuneration. Meanwhile, considerable efforts in development programming to level the playing field have been met with mixed results. This panel will explore contemporary challenges and ways forward to narrow these gender gaps and promote access to productive resources and opportunities. I'm delighted to chair this panel with 3 distinguished speakers who will share with you their findings and insights from research and from practical experience on the ground, drawing on lessons learned and projects and programs implemented in different countries. We will be drawing on examples from different countries in the world, from Africa, from Colombia, from Pakistan, and we'll also pick up some of the themes that distinguished speakers yesterday shared with us. Our first speaker this morning is Laura Doering, Assistant Professor of Strategic Management, Rotman School of Management, University of Toronto. Laura argues that although self-employment is an important component of many development strategies, aiming to enhance earnings and employment among low-income populations, women tend to earn less than men through self-employment. This calls into question the effectiveness of self-employment as a tool for bolstering women's earning. Through her work, Laura identifies a novel intervention that boosts women's return to self-employment and reduces the gender earnings gap in an informal residential market. Her study offers a new perspective on how gender and microgeography intersect to shape self-employment and sheds light on how self-employment can function as a lever for women's economic mobility in developing countries. Our second speaker is Shariff Khalil, Chief Executive Officer of the Aga Khan Foundation in Canada. We will hear from Khalil invaluable insights on how the foundation has been promoting women's economic and social empowerment in some of the most geographically isolated parts of the world, focusing on improving women's agency, creating more equitable household and community relations, and addressing structural barriers to equality. Drawing on the successful implementation of Enhancing Employability and Leadership for Youth project in Pakistan that ran for 5 years, aiming at connecting young women and men to employment and leadership opportunities and create demand for youth in the labor market, civil society, and local governance, the learning from this project have helped to shape the Aga Khan Foundation approach to women economic empowerment moving forward and provide important lessons for advancing change in complex and challenging environments. Our third speaker is Markus Goldstein, Gender Practice Leader at the African region and lead economist in the research branch at the World Bank. Markus will share with us important findings, drawing on the World Bank Gender Innovation Lab, Innovating to Grow Women's Business. Markus will share 3 sets of results from his work that are important to grow women's business. He will focus on and argue that sectors matter, that business training is not good as business as usual training, and registering businesses is important for women business growth. With that, I will turn the floor to our first speaker, Laura. We will have 20 minutes for each presentation, and then we will keep the question until the three speakers have delivered their presentations, and we'll take questions from the floor. Thank you. Laura? That's it. Yep.
Good morning. Before I dive in, I just want to take a moment to recognize how unique and productive this event is and how much work went into it. So I want to ask you a favor. Can we just take a moment to thank Sonia and Kate and the entire ISID team for all of the work that they put into this event? Thank you. I'm interested in the small and sometimes overlooked ways that economic development unfolds, and I am really looking forward to hearing from the rest of my colleagues today speak about their ambitions for large-scale projects and macro-level change, and I have tremendous admiration for that large-scale approach. But my focus is on how policies unfold in small and perhaps unexpected ways as a result of interpersonal relationships, gender biases, and in the case of the paper that I'll be discussing today, space. Individuals with scarce resources and limited economic prospects, as we've heard yesterday, often turn to self-employment as a means of earning income. Across the global South, self-employed individuals provide products and services to low-income populations and earn an income from outside the bounds of the traditional labor market. For their part, governments and development institutions often promote self-employment as an alternative and as a broader facet of economic development strategies. Although self-employment is relatively common, and is the focus of a lot of development programming, the economic returns to self-employment vary dramatically by gender. Even when running small-scale businesses in informal marketplaces, men earn significantly more than women. In an effort to counteract this wage gap, researchers have conducted numerous interventions to bolster women's earnings and returns to self-employment. These scholars have tended to implement randomized interventions to enhance women's human capital through training programs, or to build women's financial capital through access to credit and savings programs. Yet, somewhat disappointingly, what we found is that large-scale meta-analyses of these interventions have found quite minimal effects. Across Latin America, Africa, Eastern Europe, scholars find that human and financial capital interventions actually do very little to increase women's self-employment earnings. So taken as a whole, this very robust body of work and literature demonstrates how difficult it is to close the gender earnings gap. And to my colleague and I who are working on this paper, this really begs the question, are there potentially other resources that might influence women's earnings and returns to self-employment? So what I'm going to be telling you about today is a study where we're presenting a novel intervention that significantly increases women's earnings, their returns to self-employment, and closes the gender earnings gap by about 59%. So we suggest that it's possible that prior interventions may not have been able to increase women's income because they may have overlooked a critical entrepreneurial resource, which I'm going to argue is microgeographic space. So my colleague and I are inspired by the research from the sociology of space, which shows that very minor differences in the layout and structure of our microgeographic environments, like an office floor plan or the design of a residential space, can have a major effect on who we know and our ability to access resources. So for those of you in the room who are familiar, you can think of Festinger's classic study of student housing in MIT, where he found that depending on where students had been randomly assigned, whether they lived closer or further from the stairwells, had a tremendous impact on the resources that they were able to access. So building on these insights, we began to suspect that microspatial resources might be particularly important for women, particularly those who were running informal businesses from home. So across the globe, women often start informal ventures from home as a means of integrating work and family responsibilities. And given the importance of the physical space of these ventures, we think that microspatial resources could be particularly important for women who run these informal businesses. And so what I'm going to argue is that it's not just location being crucial for any entrepreneur, but that microspatial location is particularly important for women. So to explore these ideas, we looked in a Colombian housing project, and we looked at small business activity there. So this was a population that was relatively low income, many of whom had been displaced. The census was taken in 2015. There were about 3,000 individuals who lived there, 1,800 of whom were adults. And what's really unique about this setting is that individuals were randomly assigned to apartments. So they were assigned to anywhere from the ground floor to the 4th floor. And what we're most interested in is looking at these 55 adults in this housing project who started home-based businesses in the project. Now, like a good and cautious academic, I want to emphasize that 55 is not a huge number. We're looking at a relatively rare event in a single population. So while I'm very excited about these findings that I'm going to show you, I also think we want to be cautious and conservative about overgeneralizing. So as I mentioned, the apartments were randomly assigned. They were assigned by lottery in a public setting, and I'm happy to talk more about the random assignment in the Q&A if folks are curious. And we view this random housing assignment as essentially a random endowment of an entrepreneurial resource. In Colombia and many developing countries, as I mentioned, it's quite common for people to run small informal businesses from their homes using a window or a porch as an informal storefront. So individuals who are located on the ground floor of this housing project are endowed with a more advantageous entrepreneurial location, essentially because they're right next to potential pedestrian flows. And I think it helps to understand this through pictures. So here's a picture of the housing project. So if you live on the ground floor, your porch is situated right alongside the pathways that thread through the project. And you can see these are two businesses from home in the housing project that if you are a potential customer walking through this housing project, it's much easier for you to access the informal business on the ground floor than it is to access the business that's really just a few meters away. So we think that women should be particularly sensitive and responsive to favorable microspatial locations. For women, as we've mentioned, self-employment is often an alternative to the traditional labor market, and these home-based businesses allow women to integrate work and family responsibilities. So we're anticipating that women who are randomly assigned to these apartments that lend well to self-employment really will be more sensitive to the opportunities, and I'll show you some results of that right now. So indeed, what we find is that women's likelihood of starting an informal business is significantly shaped by their randomly assigned microspatial location. Women are significantly more likely to run a business if they're assigned to the ground floor than upper floors. Whereas for men, spatial location doesn't really have much of an effect on their likelihood of running a small business from home. So it seems to be women who are particularly responsive to this resource. But we don't just want to look at whether women are starting these businesses, because that in itself is not necessarily a great outcome if they're not earning much money. So we have reason to suspect that these favorable resources will be particularly valuable for women's businesses. In Colombia, like in many other countries, women sort into female-typed jobs and earn significantly less than men for the same work. So for women, it's possible that through informal self-employment, you might earn more than you would in the broader labor market. So for women in the housing project, their opportunity set in the wider labor market consists of jobs like waitressing, childcare, domestic work. For these women, a well-located business could potentially bring in more income than what they might earn from these jobs. For men, their opportunity set consists of jobs like construction or taxi driving, and a well-located business might not bring in more money than they would earn from these types of work. So this is really guiding our expectations here. And what we find, looking first at earnings, these are monthly earnings in US dollars for women. And we've broken it down by whether they're on the ground floor, upper floors, whether they're running informal businesses, or whether they're doing anything else in any other domain. We find that women who run small businesses on the ground floor earn significantly more than women who have the same spatial resources but work in other domains, as well as women who are running informal businesses from upper floors. So notably, women on the ground floor with informal businesses are earning an income that places them well above the poverty line, which is the red line on the graph there, whereas all other women are predicted to earn incomes that place them closer to the extreme poverty line. So running an informal business from a favorable location really makes a meaningful difference in women's economic experiences. For men, however, we find that microspatial location doesn't exert a significant influence on their earnings through self-employment. Men aren't earning significantly more through well-placed businesses compared to what they would be earning in other domains. So for men, having these high visibility storefronts isn't associated with making more money as compared to men who are located in similar places but are doing different types of work. We've tried to understand these data a bit more by looking at the types of businesses that women are running, and we find that their businesses on the ground floor are oriented towards quick spot transactions, as you might expect. But even when women are running the same types of businesses on the ground and upper floors, they're earning about twice as much on the ground floor. We also looked at the effects of motherhood and how this affects women's business activity. And we find that mothers are significantly more likely than non-mothers, or slightly more likely than non-mothers, to run businesses in advantageous locations on the ground floor. But what's really interesting and kind of disheartening is that it's actually mothers who are much more likely on upper floors in less favorable locations who are more likely to start businesses. So you see the real sort of constraint coming out if you're not in a great location, but you are a mother and you're sort of constrained by your family obligations. So just to give you an overview of the findings, we argue that microspatial resources have a powerful impact on women's informal business activity and their earnings. We find that women are particularly responsive to spatial locations that favor business founding, and that women who run businesses from favorable locations earn twice as much as similar others and close the gender earnings gap in self-employment by 59%. And what's important to underscore here is that space is not just a general entrepreneurial asset, but one that has specifically important outcomes and effects for women. So why is a good spatial location so important for women but less important for men? We have some initial ideas about this. We think that these locations afford women a certain visibility that may help them to overcome biases in the labor market. Researchers have demonstrated that women's work endeavors are more likely to be overlooked than men's and are generally assumed to be of lower quality. So as a result, consumers may overlook women's informal businesses. And research also shows that women are less inclined to publicize their accomplishments and may be penalized for self-promotion, so women may be less actively publicizing their ventures. So we suspect that having a business in a high visibility location helps women to overcome some of these limitations and biases just by virtue of where they're located physically in space. In terms of policy implications, I think an important thing to take away from this is that although most research suggests that self-employment from home is really a losing proposition for women, Our study offers some evidence for the fact that running a small business from home can potentially serve as a pathway out of poverty. But again, I want to emphasize that I think this study is an interesting data point, but it's just one data point. So the next step is to see if we see similar results in different contexts, as well as different market contexts. We can ask the question, do we see these similar effects in public outdoor markets? If a woman has a prime location in a fruit and vegetable market, does that give her sort of relatively more earnings advantages compared to men having the same excellent spatial location? We can also think more about what really is it about this visibility that is really boosting women's earnings in such a dramatic way. So in my view, what these findings really do is to provide a starting point for thinking about how these very microspatial resources affect women's self-employment and opens up the door for future explorations and research. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great delight to be here. In addition to my role with the Elkind Foundation Canada, I'm very happy and proud to say that I'm a member of the advisory board of the McGill Institute for the Study of International Development. So I'm both proud and a bit delinquent, frankly, as a member of that board. But really delighted to be here and to be seeing how far the institute has come over the many years that I've been involved as a member of that board. So congratulations to all of you who have been involved. Now I'm a practitioner, a sandwich between two researchers. Which with these two has been very comfortable, but it is not always the case. And indeed, I'm speaking to a room full of researchers, and so I'm delighted to be here because I do think that this articulation between those who are devoting their lives to understanding and studying the issues of women's empowerment in the variety of contexts in the global South that we're working have a lot to teach us, but we're always not listening, frankly. And I think that there's a lot for us also to contribute to helping to shape the forward research agenda that you are pursuing. So I'm delighted to be here as a small contribution to the discussions. What I wanted to do in the time I have is three things. I want to say a little bit, very briefly, introduce the Elkind Development Network and some of its features that have brought us to the issues that we're talking about today. Then I want to spend most of our time just sharing the outlines of a multi-input effort that we have been involved in over the last several years in northern Pakistan, which is a region of Pakistan where we've been involved for decades on a number of development fronts, much of it in partnership with Global Affairs Canada and previously CEDA, along with a number of other donors. And then finally, I wanted to end with a reflection on a kind of a case study within that case study of a particular region in the north, which has been the geography in the north where the state of women's development has been the least advanced of all parts of even this relatively conservative area. So let me start with the Elkind Development Network. The Elkind Development Network is a very large family of global development institutions that spans both project work of typical development institutions, but it also includes a number of permanent institutions that are working both in the commercial for-profit sector as kind of an impact investor, as well as in the not-for-profit social service delivery space in Africa and Asia. We span a number of different areas. These are the full set of agencies that are active now as part of the family, and you'll see that it includes 2 universities, the Elkind University, University of Central Asia. The Elkind Education Services is a network of some 300 schools in Africa and Asia. The Elkind Health Services is a very large provider of not-for-profit health care. The Elkind Fund for Economic Development, the economic development pillar operates on a commercial basis. It is our for-profit international development agency that takes active management control and large equity stakes in commercial ventures in the developing world, where a typical commercial investor simply wouldn't engage, but where we feel that the social economic multipliers provide a strong development case for engaging. And so the Elkind Fund for Economic Development is involved in a number of commercial ventures in tourism, in industry, and financial services. And then the Elkind Trust for Culture is working on the intersection of culture and development. Essentially, the basic insight here is that chronic poverty and cultural degradation often are twin conditions, and working on the issue of cultural revitalization can often be a spur, a trampoline to socioeconomic development in all kinds of ways. The 2 points I want to make for this audience about this system of institutions is, first, that they represent a multi-input response to the complex issues of development in the places where we are working. So there's no silver bullet here. These are many bullets trying to work simultaneously over long periods of time, including with establishing permanent institutions, right? The universities are meant to be an indefinite part of the developing world context in which they are present to help kind of support a particular kind of development trajectory in those parts of the world. So this is not just project work. This is also the establishment of permanent institutions. And the second thing for this audience I want to highlight is that the issue of women's empowerment has been a decades-long preoccupation of these institutions across the board. There have been efforts, iterative efforts across these institutions to understand and diagnose areas of gender gap and try to impact them in a variety of ways, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, but it is an ever-present set of efforts. And so there is lots for us to learn internally, and I'm not sure we do that as well as we could be across all of these things, but I just simply want to put to you that as a practitioner organization, it's our view that we have to think about this in a very broad way across multiple sectors and across multiple ways in order to address the issue. This is the range of geographies in which Elkind Foundation Canada today is involved in supporting the global network in its work. And you will see that this is very diverse, which helps also explain our view, which was echoed several times in yesterday's sessions about the importance of contextuality in our work, because you'll see our work ranges from the mountains of Central Asia, post-Soviet Central Asia, I'll say, because, of course, that post-Soviet fact has a major implication for the status of women. I mean, in fact, one of the great inheritances of the post-Soviet Central Asia is the very active role of women in both markets and in the public sphere in the post-Soviet world. And in fact, there's been quite a bit of backsliding since then, but that's one of the great inheritances that is worth thinking about for Central Asia, to South Asia, where we know of the challenges there, through East and West Africa, and even the Middle East. So it is our view that context is very, very important. It's not everything, but it is a lot. One of our struggles as a practitioner organization across these various geographies is to be able to try to have enough in common so we can have a functional conversation amongst ourselves about what's going on in different places, with enough freedom and latitude to be able to focus on the specific issues that we are dealing with in each of these areas. So let me spend a couple of minutes just talking about the economic empowerment elements that we've been working on. Our view on women's economic development has these two elements, that it's both about succeeding and advancing economically, so it's actually creating new and sustained income streams, but it's also about the power and agency to actually benefit from those economic activities. And again, I think we talked about some of this yesterday in the sessions, that it's not just about the objective fact of being successful economically. There's a whole system in which the woman who is earning is embedded that may or may not allow her to benefit from the economic returns that she is involved in. And of course, that reminds us again of an issue that was raised yesterday in multiple ways, which is that it's very difficult to isolate economic empowerment from the broader issues of social and political empowerment more generally. Although I have to say that the economic lens does provide certain specific features that if we look at things only in social and political terms, we will miss. So we do think it's useful to look at things from an economic empowerment lens, but to be mindful that there are many, many other issues in which these things are embedded. These are the mountains of the Himalayas. This is where this work is going to be. Laura's just talked about kind of spatial inequalities, and one of the features of the project I'm going to talk about is in northeastern Pakistan is that these are very, very remote places. I mean, they literally are living in the valleys of some of the highest mountain peaks in the world, and cut off from all kinds of economic and social and political both forces and supports, and subject to all kinds of very unusual economic, political, and social forces. So you'll see some of the, I've included a lot of photographs because geography is very, very important in these contexts. I wanted to get a sense of the place in which this is all happening. Over the last several years, we've developed a view of women's economic empowerment that is very linked to the notion of thinking about the broader market systems in which each of the actors we're working with exist. And the reason that that's important for us is that as a development actor, we are very interested in trying to shift the overall ecosystem from A to B, rather than simply being an intervener on our own account that then kind of ends when we stop intervening. So we're very interested in understanding the broader ecosystem of actors and how they interact amongst each other, and what kind of interventions might shape the ecosystem in one way or the other that might help the overall development objective we're seeking. So with respect to women's economic empowerment, here are the 5 things that we look at. The first one is, of course, the issue of economic advancement, which is to say, are there new and important sustained income streams available? What are women's access to opportunities and life chances? What is the access to assets, services, and supports? This one is very important, especially for remote areas like this, because it is a generalized issue that remote parts of the developing world tend to have very, very little access to support. I mean, some of these parts have just been forgotten, if not only neglected, and their access to sustained development support is almost nil. So this issue for us is very, very important. The fourth one is decision-making authority. Once you have control, once you have access to certain kinds of assets or opportunities, what is the level of decision-making control in relation to those access and opportunities? And then the overall issue of manageable workloads, and this came up yesterday, which is to say that more often than not, women simply add income-producing activity to the long list of other non-income-producing responsibilities that they have, and that becomes itself a major compromise. So let me talk a little bit about this effort in northern Pakistan. So the area we're talking about here is in northeastern Pakistan, now known as Gilgit-Baltistan, and then a region, the northern region of the Khyber-Pakhtunkhwa province known as Chitral. Mountainous, very, very remote, bordering Afghanistan, China, and the line of control, and then obviously the rest of Pakistan on the south. It is very diverse. It's about 1.5 million people, and you'd be shocked how diverse it is. It is almost entirely Muslim, although not entirely Muslim, but of various different traditions. In fact, it exhibits a great diversity within Islam in this area. And in terms of traditions, it is different from valley to valley. The processes of development, social, cultural change literally are different from valley to valley. And so there is a great deal of contextuality even required within the region, not only comparing the region to other parts. Our effort had 2 pillars. One was an employability and economic advance pillar, and the second was a leadership pillar. This second one, I'm going to say a word about and then not say a lot more about now. We can pursue it more in the questions if there is. The The role of young people and of women in community governance has been a long preoccupation of ours in the northern Pakistan. And that's because the Elkind Rural Support Program, which is the anchor institution in the north for us, has been involved since 1980s in a bottom-up community development effort. And that community development effort's linchpin has been the creation of village organizations, the creation and support and development of village organizations, even in the remotest valleys, as a means for the creation of collective action institutions that are representative of those valleys and those villages to actually pursue collective goals, development goals, and to mobilize external resources in their pursuit. Those institutions have been absolutely essential to whatever development gains have been achieved in the north. And as those institutions move on from their original conception in the 1980s to second and third generation leadership, the question of the broader participation of both women and young people has become a major area of fragility and focus. And so we were very, very interested in looking at how, in terms of public space and community governance and the role of these and the strength of these institutions, women and young people might participate. So this was an important part of it. I won't say much about it today, but we can spend more in the question period. The other pillar was economic empowerment and economic engagement, and here we had basically two levers. One was we wanted to make some investments to prepare young women for the labor market, but we also wanted to make investments in preparing the overall market for these women and these young people. So these were bifocal investments, looking at both the population that we were seeking to serve, as well as the broader market and the system in which they were inhabiting. So let me give you some examples. On the investing in young people, there was a major skills development component to what we were doing. This was premised on a set of labor market assessments about where the region was going, where the opportunities were, talking to employers, and trying to understand where the big employment gaps were, and then developing training programs to allow people to participate in these. But the flip side of that was thinking hard about the overall system of skills development in the north, which it turns out is has many, many service providers, all of them subscale, with very, very uneven quality. So at the same time as we're thinking about how to make sure individuals were able to access specific training opportunities, we were also making investments in the overall ecosystems of skill development institutions in the north, creating an association, looking at quality control, looking at accreditation, looking at new forms of training. Professor Kabir talked about the black box of training. I mean, it's absolutely the case that the availability of effective, novel means of actually doing the training is simply unavailable to most parts of the developing world. So things like, on-the-job training or work-integrated learning were largely absent in this part of Pakistan. So the idea was to invest both in the ecosystem of skills development providers at the same time as focusing on individuals and helping them access the right skills development opportunities. I would say that the success of the effort, if there is going to be one, will be whether or not we can sustain the entrepreneurial activity of the skills development sector in the north to be far more market-oriented, to engage much more with employers on an ongoing basis, and to maintain quality standards that allow young people who actually enroll in them to actually become employable. The second part of our investments in the service in the skills development sector was making it more women-friendly. So you have a sector here that is essentially gender-blind, and in fact, massively tilted toward male students. So there were a whole set of interventions in consultation with women who were ready to kind of sign up to be trained about what needed to happen in the sector for this to become a much more accessible opportunity for women. And it's everything from to childcare issues, again, which were raised yesterday, to making sure there were enough female instructors. I mean, this ended up being a major driver. There simply were very, very few female instructors in most of the skills development institutions in the north. And so there was a big push to increase the number of female instructors, which automatically increased the number of female students who were ready to access these opportunities. On the preparing the market for young people, the big focus here was on individual value chain development. And again, I want to emphasize how granular and specific the work needs to be. we had identified 4 or 5 subsectors in the north: tourism, high-value horticulture, construction, and for each of these, a very detailed value chain assessment done to understand how the entire value chain is stacked against or favors women. And trying to understand where do the gender gaps flare up in each step of the value chain. Let me give you an example. It turns out that in some of these value chains, marketing is the big issue. Men are able to be much more mobile and kind of peddle their products in a way that women have not been able to. So providing support to women to be able to think about their marketing role, to access the most elite markets in the country for their product, but also to strengthen their bargaining power in relation to other parts of the value chain, massively important for women in a way that it was not the case or not needed for men. So I would say for each of these value chains, a gender analysis has to be conducted at the step-by-step level to understand where are the specific gaps, and then to be able to develop a portfolio of interventions that help to overcome those gaps. And again, not all of them are going to be successful. And again, Professor Kabir talked about the idea of iterative learning yesterday, and that's exactly what's essential here, which is to say, you're going to identify a gap, you're going to try a series of interventions, only some of them will work, and then you're going to kind of build on them and try to continue to experiment. So let me just say that we've got some results. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on these stats, but we've got some early objective measures that show that, look, we know that there's been an uptake in employment of young women. Objectively, we know that compared to our baseline conversations with women about how much power they felt they have in decision making in the household, that there was a real increase here. And we also saw some increase in young women's membership in these women's organizations, which have been dominated by, frankly, older women, and where young women had been systematically shut out. And this is a number that's not as high as we'd like it to be, but we saw some green shoots here and something we need to continue to working on. And then we have some good numbers on income growth as well. Let me just say a word about this small part. So this is the overall region we're working. I want to talk about this one district called Diamur. Diamur is among the most remote parts of this very remote part of the north, where access by external development agencies has basically been zero until very, very, very recently. A local institution backed by the provincial government has now been created that is starting to work on issues, but we've got literacy rates of women in Diamur that are probably in the low single digits. I mean, 3-4%. Even the male literacy rates are probably only around 20 or 22%. Very, very remote. They're quite cut off from the main highway, and there are probably parts of Diamur which for parts of the year during the winter are simply not accessible at all. The levels of women's mobility outside the home, very, very, very low. So this was an area where, when Professor Valdez yesterday was talking about working with men, in order to begin working in this area, we had to begin working with the men. And we had to begin working the men in two ways. The first one was, the first request from the leaders of Diamur was to in fact do this employment training for their young men. And we accepted that, and we began working with the young men. And over time, it allowed us to have a conversation about introducing this to young women as well. And what was required is patient and thoughtful entrepreneurial efforts by skilled people on the ground from the region. So our leadership here, our staff here, are entirely from the north. And their ability to work with the leadership of Diamur has been instrumental to this. They identified the opportunity that there were a number of families from this district who were, for a series of reasons, had relocated to the town center in Gilgit, and decided the first way to work with young women from Diamur was to work with those who were already left Diamur, but of course who had lots of connections back, and began working with them. And then identified a few of their networks to get introduced into a youth internship program. As part of kind of an employment effort. So slowly but surely, this effort began to bear fruit in very, very small ways. I mean, I don't want to oversell this, in very, very small ways. But for the first time, we have dozens of young women from Diamond now involved in some kind of employment and entrepreneurial kind of activity. Our team now on the ground would say to you these three things. I think, first of all, they would say that the need for strong local champions among the leadership, wherever that may be, it could be traditional leaders, in this case it was also religious leaders, and a few role models are absolutely essential to beginning a process of development change. The second one is this whole issue of social influencers. Every community exists in a network, and understanding that network and understanding where you can intervene in that network at different points in time in order to create a snowball of change, very, very important. And finally, this idea that we are on an early path, that what we're talking about is a long-term process of development change that needs to have a start and then a support over time. And again, Professor Kabir talked about the idea of longer-term iterative efforts and adaptive learning on the part of institutions, which resonated with me a great deal. You know, development finance forces us to think about things in 4 or 5 year projects. And so fine, we projectize our efforts. But in effect, what is needed is quasi-permanent scaffolding to the process of development change that can adjust and adapt to circumstances as those circumstances change. And those can't be achieved in 4 or 5 year increments. Now, you can achieve things in 4 or 5 year increments, but they're only meaningful if seen in the context of effectively generational kinds of processes of change. And we should never discount, it seems to me, small, directionally correct improvements. Small, directionally correct improvements are often the fuel that allows us to sustain these efforts over time. Now, too often, my own view is that we cut the legs off of these things far too prematurely. It's very hard for us to understand the complex social, cultural, economic, and political factors that allow a small change over time to actually break into a massive process of transformation. It's very, very hard to know that ex ante. We can look back and understand that point, but ex ante is very, very difficult. What that means is that the demands of patience and persistence on the part of practitioners in the face of some of these obstacles is elemental. And time horizon is the singular resource that we have if that's the posture we're going to take. Let me just say, therefore, a few of the things that I would say are important practices for us in all of this. We've talked about comprehensive gender analyses. I would say this field is changing rapidly. It's becoming much more sophisticated, much more nuanced. I would say the field here is very uneven in quality. And as a practitioner, my plea is for us to be able to underwrite the quality of expertise who is able to come and perform this kind of gender analyses. Because there's no recognized credential, as soon as this becomes of interest to funders, everyone becomes an expert gender analysis person. And this will be the death knell of serious efforts in this regard. And so I would say that comprehensive gender analysis is absolutely essential. We need both expertise in people who are ready to provide this kind of gender analyses, as well as expertise in those of us who have to be consumers of this kind of analyses. And it has to be done in ways which are fully understandable and transparent and participatory of the women themselves who are involved at the front line, and frankly, the men who are involved in these communities we're talking about. This is a very, very demanding skill. And those of you who have any interest in this area, I would really encourage you to kind of move in this area. I think it's a very, very complicated and demanding skill to be able to perform the high-level analysis, the detailed granular analysis I've talked about, engage all the right stakeholders, including the people on the ground whose lives are going to be most affected, being able to connect local knowledge, cultural mores, social and political forces, along with global best practice and global understanding of the research. It's very, very complicated. But it's now very clear that it's essential to us. And so much of what we're able to do programmatically and as a set of interventions turns on the quality of gender analyses that we're able to develop. We've talked already about the structures and power relations that we can work on individual lives, and we must. Often, the individual stories become role models that end up actually having, over time, a systemic effect, but they're not alone enough. The involvement of women and girls in all of this as consult. In fact, what really needed is not only to consult women and girls, but to allow them to lead the way. And increasingly, where we have seen the most success is where women and girls who are most affected are the ones who, over time, began taking on the leadership responsibilities for the programming themselves. The flexibility is essential. The iterative learning here is absolutely elemental. And of course, we're here to promote agency, which is to say, I think Bipasha yesterday talked about threading the needle between seeing women as victims to seeing victims as kind of the heroes who are going to solve all of our development problems and burdening women with it all. This idea of women's agency to be able to choose the path they're going to take, to be able to have the environment in which to make those choices in safe and supported ways, and to be able to have time and efforts with other women in solidarity to do that has been also a major lesson for us. Let me just end with 3 words that Yasmin Karim, who's from the North and is our lead of so much of our most innovative gender work up in northern Pakistan. Her watchwords to us always are patience, flexibility, and courage. Patience, we've talked about. Flexibility, we've talked about. Let's not underestimate the reservoirs of courage that are continually drawn upon by the women and many of the men who choose to confront in situ and in practice some very, very entrenched forces of social and cultural bias that exist in these environments. And we should never shortchange how much courage is required. Now, we cannot have programs based on courage alone. That's a grand failure on us all. But let's also not underestimate, especially in some of the most difficult environments, how much courage is required for the people who we are working with to exercise on an ongoing basis. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Markus?
That one? Yeah, just pick one, I'll do it. No, that's that one. Good God. Yes. Thank you. Okay, I've got all these ideas bouncing around in my head. I'll try and be coherent. So what I'm... Take a minute, yeah, let's reflect for a moment. So what I'm going to talk about today is some work coming out of the Africa Gender Innovation Lab. For those of you who don't know us, we're an outfit within the World Bank, kind of a very strange unit for the World Bank. But we try and figure out through rigorous research what works and what doesn't to address gender inequalities in the economic realm. And then we really try and get that evidence used for policy. Try and learn how to speak to people like Khalil. Okay, so 3 ideas that I sort of want to talk about today. One is, we've heard it already, is that sector matters. So maybe we can understand something about how it matters and how to get over the obstacles there. Then I want to, Nyla gave us a lot of reasons to be depressed about business training yesterday, and I totally agree with her. And so I'm going to give you a reason to be optimistic, hopefully. And then I'll talk about formalization, which I also would be pessimistic about. So maybe I can give you some optimism there, too. Let's see. All right. So I think one point to keep in mind is that there are themes going on here, right? And so I'm going to start with sector, and the themes here that I'm trying to allude to are thinking about norms and markets and how those things interact. So we heard earlier in this session about the importance of occupational segregation in explaining the earnings gap between men and women. This is from the World Development Report in 2012. And if you look at construction, It doesn't matter if you're Swedish. You look a lot like Mexico. I presented this in Sweden. That was so there aren't a lot of women in construction anywhere, but we're going to see some in a minute. Manufacturing, you'll find more women, and so I think what's striking to me about this graph is, Sweden, Bangladesh, Mexico. There's not a lot of differences in the fact that men and women are in different jobs, and that's part of the earnings gap. So, first studies that I want to talk about are two studies that look at the women who defy the odds. And these are, the one in Uganda in particular is a mixed method study trying to understand how they got there. And actually, Betty, who's on the right here, yeah, for you, she's a metal worker in Kampala, and she's going to be part of the study. All right, let's start with the earnings gap. So if you look at microenterprises in Kampala, you can see that female-dominated enterprises, like hair salons, which are actually spelled with two O's in Kampala, they're not drinking establishments. They're not very profitable, okay? But when you compare them to things like metal fabrication and electricals, which are male-dominated. Okay, so there's a big earnings gap. These are average monthly profits by those sectors. So what we do is we call the women who break into male-dominated industries crossovers. It's a lot easier than saying women who break into male-dominated industries all the time. So when you look at Ethiopia, when you look at the monthly profits, the women, these are only women, the ones who go into the male-dominated industries are making a lot more money. Flipping back to Uganda, they make the same as men. So this is rare, but it does happen that once you break the sectoral barrier, the earnings actually totally equalize. Okay, so it's a bit striking. Okay, so fantastic. There are some women, they do it, they make the same. Who are they, and how did they get there? There's a bunch of things that don't matter that I personally thought would. All right, first is education, maybe you could argue, but education doesn't matter. It's not skills in any way we can measure. Okay, we did all the entrepreneurial, business, psychology, IQ, blah, blah, blah. Anything we could measure, they may be slightly different in a couple of the psych variables, but no, there's no real skill, cognitive, non-cognitive, that sort of stands out. So it's not skills, okay? It's not education, it's not skills. It also isn't capital, all right? I really thought it was capital, because the male industries are more capital intensive. There's a bit of a story in Uganda, because we're doing the mixed methods, we can get sort of the real origin story. There's a bit of story that they may delay more because it takes them longer to get to that capital point, but they don't sort of speak to capital as a major obstacle. So first thing lots of things that I thought would matter did. First thing that does is information. This is a really hard graph to understand, and I always explain it wrong. But so these are all women who they're in female-dominated industries, and they make less than the average male-dominated firm, okay? What's important are the bottom two parts of the graph. So altogether, about 2/3 of the women in Ethiopia think that they statistically make less than men, but they all think they make the same or more. All right, we see a similar pattern in Uganda. It's slightly more pronounced. So there's not a lot of information for the women in these these female-dominated industries, the non-crossovers, about the relative profitability of the male-dominated sectors. Interestingly, in Ethiopia, the team also looked at the men. They don't know that they make more. So it's there's just an information problem in general. All right. What really came out in the stories was psychosocial factors. So these women told stories of mentors, often male, who helped them get into these jobs. The first job also matters. If you start as a metal worker, you're in good shape. But if you start as a caterer, the odds of switching later are much less likely. Another striking thing, in addition to this male mentorship pattern, is teachers. Teachers are the death knell for this. Okay, so if your teacher was your influencer in your first job, in choosing your first job, you're 15 times more likely to end up in a female-dominated sector. Okay, so teachers are primary, particularly when they give career counseling, are primary reinforcers of these gender norms. All right, and I've presented this in front of a bunch of teachers, and they're all like, absolutely. So, great. So the policy implications, fairly obvious from that. Let's work with teachers. That's a good starting point. I think you can target vocational training, and we're trying this in a number of countries already, to try and get girls to switch. We funded a study, not done by us, but done by others, in Kenya that actually did the information bit. And they got a lot of girls to switch into car mechanic training. They showed them a video and showed them how much they'd earn, and the girls did switch. They didn't survive the training. They sort of dropped out. So I think this mentorship piece may be the part that's missing, and we're working on how to actually operationalize that right now. Okay, and then obviously information, clearly a problem. We need to figure out how to make that happen more generally. Okay, let me get to the second idea, business training. So luckily, Nyla did the literature review yesterday, so I'll spare you. The evidence is not good, okay? Business training doesn't work for women. In most contexts, the way we've been doing it, doesn't work for men either, okay? So just keep that in mind. So that raises the question. I think there was a lot of soul searching when these reviews started to come out among the business training people. So are we training the wrong people? Do we need to target better? Are we teaching the wrong skills? Okay, is it a curriculum problem? Or do we need to add something else? Development professionals just love to add something else. So there was a lot of, oh yes, we have to add cash grants. Yes, always throw money. Anyhow, so what I want to try and do is argue that it's actually the wrong skills. So what we do in this study is we brought a new kind of business training, which came out of business psychology. It's called personal initiative training, and it emphasizes things like goal setting, being proactive, future orientation, overcoming obstacles. All right? It all sounds great. What does that actually mean? Yes, it's really hard to explain. So standard training is how to keep records, types of products banks offer, what you need for a loan in terms of paperwork, how to register your business. Personal initiative training is how to think like an entrepreneur. So identify and think about unusual sources of money. What can you do to get cash besides the bank? How do you bootstrap so you don't have to rely on external funding in the long term? And also, what's plan B? What's plan C? Okay? So it's very much trying to get at this persistence, future orientation, making noises in the ceiling. All right? And so what we did was a randomized controlled trial. One group of entrepreneurs in Lomé, Togo, got personal initiative training. One group got standard business training, which was actually a World Bank product. Wait till you see the results. And that's why I'm here and I can't go back. And the last group got nothing so that we could sort of see what, relative to the business as usual, what would happen. Okay. I added that slide. Sorry, it's not in the one you have. So here's the results on profits. All right? The blue bar is the personal initiative training. Significantly higher profits per month, $60 per month. The standard business training, no statistically significant impact, particularly for women, and thus there's a difference between the two training that's large. So for women, so that's for women and men together, the results I just showed you. For women, the results are even more striking. The effects of that gap is even bigger. It's fascinating to see that this personal initiative training led to much higher innovation in the product space. They got more credit, okay? There wasn't some lone form training, but there was this sort of think how to get finance, and they did. They invested more, they were hiring more people, and then they had higher profits. Okay. So maybe that gives us some hope in the business training space, and hopefully I did some unpacking of the black box. I think, honestly, with this training, you kind of have to sit through it to really get excited. I left it, and I was like, oh, I got to be an entrepreneur. Yeah. Okay. So now I want to talk about registering businesses. So honestly, I don't understand why people would want to register their business. There's arguments on both sides. And the literature sort of lines up with my prior belief, which is when you do a business registration program, people don't come. It's sort of like the take-up from Nyla's training would be spectacular. Nobody registers. So, and when they do, yeah, not much happens. Okay. I mean, the best is when they even pay people to register. Not like I'm going to make it easy. I'm just going to pay you. No, still. All right. So why should that stop us? We did another randomized controlled trial, but we did have an idea about, like, okay, maybe we just won't do registration. So Malawi, like many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, business registration and tax registration are separate things. Okay? So one group here gets free, costless business registration. We come to your business, we help you fill out the forms, we take them and deal with the bureaucrats and bring you back the registration. Okay? That, honestly, it takes them a lot of time. When you do a couple hundred at a time, the government actually expedites it, and it's much better to do it collectively. So it's cheaper for us than it would be for them individually, which is something to keep in mind. The second group, not only did we offer them costless business registration, but we offered them a great opportunity to register for a taxpayer number. There are actually some contracts you can get with a taxpayer number, so there is a benefit, but of course there are those taxes. And then the third group got an information session, sort of a short day and a half kind of information session with a bank, commercial bank, and also help, if they wanted to open a business bank account, all right? Because you need to be registered as a business to get a business bank account, all right? So the idea here is that not only is the state not working in terms of making the registration easy, but the market's not working in terms of helping the entrepreneurs get to those business bank accounts. So people register, all right? You make it totally costless. All three groups register their businesses at pretty high rates. It's sort of 76%, I think, on average. Great. So now we're going to forget about these groups that don't have the business bank account, because they registered and not much else changed for them, okay? So you register, yippee. Harassment doesn't change, doesn't go up, doesn't go down. Registered, big deal. That's the story with those two groups. What's really interesting is that third group, all right? So the first thing is they start using financial services. They think they can borrow more money, which is good. They actually do borrow more money. That's even better in terms of the data being accurate. They get insurance. That goes from 1% having insurance to 8% having insurance. And they start to be more likely, both the men and women, I was surprised by the men here, are more likely to say they don't take the business money for household expenses. So they start to do these separate mental accounts. And the profits go up. Okay, sales go up. There's no significant difference between men and women here. Sales go up by around 20%, and profits go up as well. All right? So financial service registration, financial services, and this business bank account and higher profits. But it's only when those two things are put together. So let me wrap up here. Started with the sector matters, right? We know about occupational segregation, but I think we can learn a lot from the women who defy the norms and how they make that happen, and use that to design programs. I was surprised because it wasn't sort of the skills or the factors that I thought would matter didn't matter. It was more this information and mentoring. Business training, it's quite possible that we've been focusing on the wrong skills, on the process of a business rather than how to think like an entrepreneur. And in environments where there are multiple constraints and institutions are stacked against you, maybe those kinds of skills matter more than the process kind. And the third is this combination of the state not working too well and the market not working too well, and thinking about addressing both of those at the same time with not an overly complicated intervention, and that making a difference as well. I'll stop here. For the papers, Malawi there is no paper yet, there's a brief, but the papers that I've discussed, they're on the web. Thank you.
Great. I'm going to stand so I can see all of you and don't miss anyone. We have plenty of time for questions. I would take 2-3 questions at a time and give the opportunity to our speaker to answer, and then we go for another round. So anyone that would like to ask a question, please. Okay. I would start with Professor Kabir.
I need the mic, yeah. Oh,
No?
she's coming with
All right.
the microphone.
I enjoyed all 3 of those presentations. I learned a lot, so thank you very, very much. I've looked up your paper and I'm going to try and download it, but it's not easy. So I have a question for you. I won't repeat that. It was for you. So I have a question for the other two. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about how religion looks different in the area in which the Aga Khan, does it look different in the area of the Aga Khan Foundation's projects? Because you mentioned something about it at the beginning, and I didn't take it in. And I wondered if you were working in a different part of Pakistan, whether you would have different kinds of approaches. And thank you very much, Markus. I will revisit the training stuff. But I wondered if you could draw out, you said you sat through the initiatives training, personal initiatives training, and I wonder if you could draw out what it was about that training that made it effective in a way that the more standardized business training was not.
Okay, thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, everyone, for your presentations. My question is for Professor Doering. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the time frame of the project that you're involved in. I ask this because I'm curious to know more about the interaction between these women entrepreneurs, given that they live, kind of in shared spaces in some sense. So once they see the people on the ground floor kind of thriving with their businesses and individual businesses, what kind of interaction did you see between these women holders, towards, was there, I'm curious to know whether there was any move to a more collective business model, so if you could talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Thanks. One more question?
We have questions on the back.
Okay, I was going to work out because there's lots of questions. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Hi. This question is for Markus. I would like to know, Markus, if you have more information about the type of training the trainers had for the 2 studies. As an evaluator, I felt, well, in my nonprofit, we started designing, implementing, and evaluating programs. And I realized that as an evaluator, I wasn't considering many of the variables that are key to have success in a program. So for example, the previous training of my trainers, the number of hours that they received the training, the quality of the trainer of trainers. And these are things that sometimes in the evaluation we see like, oh, the intervention, boom. But there's a lot of things that we need to know to see if the intervention can be really effective. So sometimes I think that it could be risky to say, oh, skills wasn't statistically significant, but do we know exactly about the quality of that training so that we can say that it wasn't really skills, but rather the trainers were not really qualified to do what they were supposed to do? Thank you.
All right, who wants to start? Check the questions. And then we'll go.
I can start with Professor Kabir's question about religion. So I guess what I would say about religion in the North is that it's astonishingly diverse. So that, it's about, 1.5, 1.6 million people, and you have in the North multiple traditions of Sunni Islam, multiple traditions of Shia Islam, you've got multiple Sufi traditions, and then you've got the non-Muslim minority in Chitral. So I would say that I think it's hard to point to religion having any one uniform effect, but I think one has to be ultra attentive to the religious context in the engagement as part of the entire contextual analysis. I'm, I guess, resisting giving any primacy of place to religious analysis because I actually think in practice we're seeing it as only one factor. What is interesting is that religious leaders are an important part of the equation in almost every one of these contexts. And so the engagement early and throughout of religious leaders, which are usually traditional leaders in these areas, is essential. And again, even in parts which one would think are very, very conservative, almost always you'll find a diversity of views even among the religious leaders. So there is no monolith here. There is no monolith here. What we have is a diversity of expressions and a diversity of views among the individuals who are claiming authority, of leadership authority. And part of what we're talking about here is helping the community leadership, whether it's religious or otherwise, come to a process of change in the kind of social and economic mores. Now, what prompts that? There are a variety of things that also prompt that, right? Sometimes it's just reflection. Sometimes it's exposure to things that are happening elsewhere. Sometimes it's because something has happened in the neighboring village, right? We know this whole issue of spontaneous replication, right? It's neither spontaneous nor replicated entirely, right? I mean, it's some influence that is exerted because you see something happening next door that is of interest. And it allows you to have an in situ comparator that might inspire you in a particular kind of way. So no simple answer here, of course, but I would say it is an important part of the context, but it needs to be understood because it will be differential in literally village, valley by valley, at least to the north. I think the rest were for you.
Yeah, okay. So let me start with Nyla's question. So let me answer it in two parts. I think one thing is the way the training works. So one of the exercises they have to do is when they learn about what is proactive versus reactive, they sit with a partner who is another classmate, and they go through their days, the previous day, and sort of reflect on what was proactive, what was reactive, and discuss it. Okay, so that's, I mean, when I do that, it sort of makes me think a lot. And then I think there's that peer effect too that's going on there. So for sure it's a different curricula. I think the way it worked is that we're still working on this. There's a team of psychologists that are part of this project. And so this is a whole new interdisciplinary collaboration for me. Yet I have to learn yet another way to do statistics. And the arguments are fascinating, just on the statistics. But I think their sense, and I don't want to get too far ahead, is, because I don't think we have a definitive answers, it changed the way people act. You could argue it changed their personality, but as I understand in psychology, that's like throwing out a hand grenade, or worse. So for sure, the way they answered questions about their personality with respect to the business seemed to have moved. Okay, and I think it may be domain bound. We don't know yet, but it may be bound just to the business. We're not seeing, we did a quick rush through, these are fresh results. We did a quick rush through of the intra-household, we asked a lot. We're not seeing much move there, even though they're making a lot more money. So I think still to understand how narrow that change in mindset, to use a nice vague term, was, but definitely there's maybe even a bit of their identity as entrepreneurs becoming stronger. So more to come on that. So Susanna, great question. We really designed this so they would be equivalent. And it's working with the IFC program actually helps on this because they have an extremely rigorous approach to who can train. You have to be certified. And so those trainers are certified, I mean, for sure there's difference in the training of trainers in the sense that they're different curricula. But in terms of cost, in terms of contact time with the students, those were totally equalized in both of these trainings. But, you know, it's fascinating. We did a video with the trainers of the personal initiative, and they're just, pow. You know, you're sort of like rocked. But one guy, we had to like re-edit the audio because he was so excited that like you couldn't understand them half the time. How they learned. Anyhow, so like they end up different and so on, but that's unavoidable. But everything else was designed to be the same. Now, can you do this training with just anybody? No. So we just have early results from Ethiopia where we tried to implement it through the TVET universities, which are not the most dynamic of places. And it didn't work at all. Like we did another business training there too, a different curricula, nothing for anybody. It's not even clear there was learning. So, and there was uptake issues. So it's, you know, but Mexico, they're doing it, and early results from Mexico suggest positive impacts on profits and employment. So you can do it in multiple places, is what I would say. You can't do it with anybody, okay? You need a certain kind of trainer. I think that point's right.
Thank you. There we go. Thank you for your question. That's a really great one. So the question was about the time frame of the project, whether we saw changes over time in women's business activity. And the reason why I think it's a great question is because you're really thinking in the right direction, that if we do see women who are earning more on the ground floor with these businesses, presumably they would tell their neighbors about it, and their neighbors might potentially opt out of waitressing or childcare work and potentially start a business at home. The reason why we have not looked into that is because our data are only at a single point in time. That basically my dream data would be to look at this community over time and to watch that sort of longitudinal change. So unfortunately, we don't have that, but my expectation would be that I think your intuition is right, is that women, because in this situation, they live very close together, that they would potentially share information. There's lots of activity within this community around small-scale savings groups, and women have these recycling collectives together. So there is a lot of collective activity. I haven't seen any any sort of cooperative businesses or anything emerge in this community yet, but I would be surprised if there weren't network effects associated with business activity longitudinally. But I don't have the data, so maybe you can do that study.
Okay, there's 1, 2, 3. We have time, don't worry. Hopefully we'll accommodate all your questions.
You know, this has been a really fascinating discussion because it really works into something that I've really observed here in Canada. So I mentioned yesterday, one of the groups that I'm working with is called CEO, and I'm really super excited. And if you put me on the video, you probably have to edit it too. Because what I'm seeing, these are models by women for women, and it's completely women only. And I know we got to talk about the male side, and we did yesterday and other discussion. But just, to put it really shortly, this is women putting money into a pot, those same women making the decisions about which other women will receive the money, then surrounding them with not only tight mentoring and the kind of business training that you're talking about, Markus, and then really using that network to start the buying of products and services, and then also connecting it into the broader network. So we've got all those elements together. So I've been watching this now for the last 3 years. The demand internationally to try to do this is out of control. We can't handle it. And we're getting 300% per year growth in small businesses in Canada. So I'm not a psychologist. Simplistically, what I have sort of observed, and the word that I'm using, although I'm cautious, is self-confidence. I see these women grow incredibly in their self-confidence about their agency or their ability to do stuff, because they've got 500 kick-ass women, frankly, supporting them and believing in them. And then that process seems to unleash this perspective. So perhaps you could comment about my word about self-confidence and how you've seen that perhaps working, or if maybe it's not the right word. If you have a better word, I'd really appreciate your input and advice.
Hi, I've got a couple of questions. Laura and then Markus. You're both reaching very interesting conclusions. You're showing profits, but might the explanation be somewhat different? You don't have to go to Colombia to be worried about going up to the second floor of social housing in the world. So to what extent do you think the difference might be explained, especially if you're talking about pedestrian traffic, about an unwillingness to go into social housing, go up to the second floor between being harassed and being robbed? There are a bunch of possibilities there. And Markus, it's very interesting. You've got 3 groups, but the only group that shows a profit in terms of registration is the one that has access to finance. Are you learning anything about registration, or is this simply a finding about you've facilitated access to finance? In this case, of course, it's business accounts, but could we get the same results from similar insurance and finance products for businesses that result in profitability, and maybe there's nothing to be learned about registration?
One more.
Okay. I think there was some.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My question is for Khalil. Elkind Foundation works in very remote areas where probably subsistence economy is the case. I work also in that areas for a few years, and my question is, have you experienced a successful case from women businesses led by women that have moved up the ladder from subsistence economy up, right? And if that's the case, what has been the successful factors in the ecosystem? Okay, because in my experience, I worked 7 years on the ground. We get a lot of results in terms of power, agency, change of values, institutions, but we face extremely the wall of the market. Extremely difficult to enter the market, to compete the market, because it was a remote area, and there are other factors. If you have a successful case, what has been those factors?
Okay, thank you. Who wants to? Markus?
Okay. Yeah, so I'm not a psychologist either. So self-confidence is a good word. I think there are different constructs that, there are psychologists in the room, so I'm going to be very careful. There are different concepts that could add up to self-confidence. And so some of it is, I feel like I'm in control of my environment, or my environment dictates to me, right? So that's part of it. Or I feel like if I actually did an action, it would make a difference. And so we're looking at those sub-pieces of what, anyhow, I would think of as self-confidence. And so trying to tease out which part it is. But yeah, I think that's part of the story. So this question about finance it just being finance and not registration. So you found the Achilles heel of that study, which is we don't have an arm which is only finance. Now, part of the problem is you can't, because you can't get a business bank account if you don't register. I mean, my reading of the finance literature is you don't usually see effects like that. But these are business bank accounts, and you don't see business bank accounts without registration. So it's kind of a space we can't answer that question unless we did sort of some weird hybrid business bank account, which, totally open to doing another study. Because to me, it's this question of where's the failure the greatest? Is it the market? Is it the state? And where should we focus? We did see a slight increase in the registration-only group of business bank accounts. So, which makes me, my co-authors won't go this route, so I speculate. But I do think that group shows that there's an information failure on the part of the banks are being silly, because it cost us $27 to do the registration per person. So if these are going to be future clients, it might be worth it. But I think we got 6% increase in business bank accounts in the registration-only group, and that was significant. So some of them do overcome that information failure and go to the banks themselves. But it's much, much larger in this other group. So, the policy implication is kind of easy. You just sort of create public-private partnership where the banks are sort of visible in the registration process, and you can make things happen, maybe. So we're trying to do that. I want to interject a bit. I know that moving up the ladder question is for you, but I do think this is a huge issue because all of the businesses I talked about were small. And I think what we're seeing as we sort of try and get into this graduating from micro and small to small and medium is finances really matters a lot. And there the problem is finances depend on collateral. So now you're in property rights land. And that is, there's two ways. One is you start fixing property rights, which is a long road. And then even joint property rights don't solve this because then you need the co-signature. So in Ethiopia, men and women both need their spouse to sign off on using the house. Then you're in the intra-household bargaining space, right? So you solve the joint. The other option is to get around collateral. So can we do larger loans, individual loans, $5, $10, $15, $20, $50,000 that are not collateralized? And there, I think there's some exciting options. They're all really risky. But this is a group of the market that's really been underserved. So we're trying some things in this space. I'm happy to talk about it later. And my guess is the initial returns are going to be great because that market is totally untapped. So if you can do anything at all, the first batch of programs are going to be great. But then you start to get to the average credibility, average creditworthiness, and it's going to be much more risky. So I think we can do an initial push and it's going to look good, would be my guess. And that's going to happen. And then we're going to see these programs meet reality of more equalization of the risk.
So let me answer in a narrow way and then in a way that's a bit broader, I think. So my narrow answer is we do have examples. I don't think we have a theory about what makes it all work. Okay, so there's an example of a woman-owned construction firm that employs only women, and they're thriving, right? So there are examples, but I do think they're idiosyncratic, and we don't understand what's generalizable from these examples quite yet. I do think the collateral issue, the financing issue does come in kind of very quickly. But of course, you're raising the broader issue, which is frankly, what is the future of these remote rural environments generally for women and for men? Like, what is their economic future? It is kind of, I would say, I think for my personal view is over the next 10 or 20 years is probably the principal question, because we are increasingly on health and education getting to the last mile, right? It's now plausible to see. We're not there yet, and there's still barriers, but with grit and resources, we're going to get to the last mile on health and education. The big question now is, what is the economic future of these remote rural environments? And I think it's a serious question because the path of industrialization that was available, I think, to the East Asian economies in the 20th century is not available to most of these economies any longer for a whole set of reasons. And urbanization without that industrialization is actually getting pretty scary now, right? So what you effectively have is urban environments which can absorb the young people who are moving to them, but rural environments which don't have a future. And so there's a whole class of young people now who are in rural environments who are facing the choice between urban misery or rural hopelessness. So it's a very serious issue. Now, there is one area which I think is very important for us to think about, which is there an opportunity that's presented by the whole question of the knowledge economy and the transition to this so-called kind of fourth industrial revolution? Because in fact, the principal promise of the knowledge economy is that wealth is no longer about what you hold in your hands, but what you hold in your head. Now, what you hold in your hands turns out to be massively disproportionately distributed. But what you hold in your head needn't be. Now, what is the possible economic development strategy, a local economic development strategy that is underwritten by connecting these human capital investments, which we're now getting to the last mile on, to a viable economic development strategy? One of the concerns I have is that we have massively underinvested in advanced education institutions in rural environments. And so, and we know that the linchpin of the knowledge economy is going to be the right kind of local advanced education institutions that do a series of vocational technical training, but also do research on local kind of problems, connect to global knowledge bases in all kinds of different ways, and then create these entrepreneurial hubs and mindsets and role models and new financing models, including the possibility of equity arrangements for some of these businesses. But I would say that the challenge on the general economic development question for us over the next 10 or 20 years is there a knowledge economy future for remote rural environments in the Global South?
Thanks for your question about alternative explanations. I think it's important to think about all the various possibilities that might be driving these effects. And so you mentioned people not wanting to go up to the second floor, you know, here in Canada and elsewhere in public housing projects. And I think I see that not so much as an alternative explanation, but really the other side of the coin of people being drawn to ground floor apartments, that really anything that makes it more inconvenient to get to these businesses is you know, they're just going to have less traffic. But I think even behind that question is sort of a bigger issue of, you know, do men's and women's businesses potentially have different clientele bases? And so is it, you know, potentially do women's businesses draw more female clientele, and then those female clientele are really dissuaded from going up the dark stairwell to the fourth floor? And so I think that's a really interesting question. I also wanted to touch on Susanna's question, even though you weren't asking me. I want to dive in and respond to this, because as a researcher, I think that this is something that is really both fascinating and important, because when we look at impact evaluations and we look at the results of interventions, we often assume that those interventions are identical across place and across context. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is the way that, you know, people are different and develop different sorts of relationships with each other and may have different backgrounds. And I think that so far we may have underestimated the extent to which those invisible differences are actually driving really some of the variation that we see, and why, you know, it's often the case that we have, you know, on the surface, the same intervention producing drastically different results. I think a lot of those factors may be very closely intertwined with that variation.
Great. We have about 5-6 minutes left. We'll take a couple of questions and then we'll give a chance to the panelists to provide final comments.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for great presentations. To Laura, again, it's an alternative explanation. Mm-hmm. You didn't say what the men's businesses, informal sector businesses were, and I think I have a sense that sector and you know, geographical space are correlated, and that if men had the same kind of businesses that women had, the effects would be the same.
Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the speakers and for the interesting presentations. I find them interesting and inspiring, especially that we are combining practice with research. Please allow me to step back and talk in general about the cases you have presented. We are now talking about women economic empowerment and economic empowerment in general, and the dilemma in this is usually how to scale up. We have seen interesting findings. I know that Agaf Khan Foundation is more committed to do local development, long-term commitment, whereas other organizations like the World Bank has shorter-term span in development. So I would like you to comment on how could we make lessons learned from your experiences to scale up, because at the end we need to look at the cost of development and how we can scale up, because resources are limited and we need to use them wisely, especially when we are talking about economic development and how to connect to the local markets, so we are making more return on our investment. Thank you.
Thank you. One more and last question, please.
Thanks very much. 3 great papers. It's mostly to Khalil. You spoke about it's Arjan Haan, IDRC. You spoke about the need for a good analytical capacity on gender, and I think you suggested this shouldn't be foreign consultants that would come and do the job. Could you, and maybe they can be useful, but can you speak perhaps to examples where you found, because Aga Khan Foundation seems to be unique in terms of the kind of its in-depth time, long-term engagement with. What kind of successes have you seen in terms of your project implementation, where that kind of analysis to make those projects successful, where that worked well?
Okay, thanks so much for your question. This was about different types of businesses that maybe men are, starting different types of businesses than women. And it's interesting, we see that on upper floors, there really is a very gendered division in the types of businesses that people are starting. So women on upper floors have hair salons and more sort of traditionally female businesses. But on the ground floor, it's pretty consistent. So people who are running businesses on the ground floor oriented around these spot transactions. So it's really small grocery stores, people selling cell phone minutes, things like that. And even in that, even when men and women are running the same types of businesses, we see men earning more. So we don't have information on the types of products that they're selling or the hours that they're operating, but we do still see men earning more. So, overall in the study, we see women, particularly on the ground floor, closing that income gap, but it's not like they're at income parity. They're doing much better relative to other women, but it's certainly not closing the gap entirely.
So 2 difficult questions. I specialize in easy questions, but fine. It's McGill, so let me. So how to scale up? So I agree. I mean, look, this is, I think, related to the earlier point about is there a path for some of these micro-entrepreneurial efforts to become larger, and even for the development programs to become larger over time? Let me just say that. Of course, resources are limited. They're limited everywhere. But let's be clear that the amount invested in these kinds of things in the developing world pales in comparison to what's invested here by public institutions on entrepreneurial activity, right? I spent the day 2 weeks ago in Toronto, in the morning at Ryerson's Digital Media Zone and the afternoon at Mars in downtown Toronto, all of which is publicly financed. And these are multi-million-dollar public investments in creating the next generation of entrepreneurial activity for the knowledge economy. So let's be clear, there is no non-public investment route to underwrite the future of economic development in these societies. So I want to just be clear that we're not talking, when we talk about limited resources, it suggests that there's some kind of nifty, creative, deft way of doing it. There may be, and there has to be, but the imperative for massive public investments is essential and necessary. And we can't escape that, it seems to me. There's no innovative finance way of getting around it, I don't think, right? There's no money that you have to give back that's going to get around it. There's going to have to be money you don't give back, but that has massive, ongoing human development consequences that's going to have to be invested. I agree that scale-up is a big problem. With respect to the scale-up of development interventions generally, I do think that we've got a number of pathways. Pakistan is a good example where the Elkind Rural Support Program has spawned now rural support programs across the country, right, as part of the rural support program network. So we do have examples of efforts. The World Bank has excellent examples of these community development type things becoming generalized postures. The savings groups models that Professor Kabir talked about yesterday have proliferated, I mean, in extraordinary ways. So we do have examples of scale up, but they do tend to be confined to areas which are highly replicable in a very programmed way. And that suggests what we're looking for is not scaling up programs. What we need is scaling up mindset, right? It's a programmatic posture, which is a commitment to the implementation of certain locally rooted principles over time, and a commitment to make it work, come hell or high water, to fail, to absorb the implications of the failure, and to try again. That's what needs to be scaled up. There's no blueprint. This is music, not architecture, right? This is about sequencing of efforts over time with a commitment to make it work. On the issue of the scale-up of economic enterprise specifically, I mean, some things have already been said. Let me just say that I do think for remote rural areas, the big question is the possibility of export, right? And I don't think we're going to be able to export physical things very much because they're remote. And so the real question is, can we kind of have little Silicon Valleys kind of popping up, which is to say it's the export of knowledge-enabled, knowledge-intensive efforts. That's what can be exported. And what we have to be able to guarantee is a basic level of education, a basic level of healthcare, energy, connectivity, and then the right kind of advanced education/intellectual institution that's rooted in the problems of those environments. And maybe we know the ingredients, but not the recipe. Let me put it that way. I think if we had those ingredients with a variety of recipes, we may be able to see the possibility of real scale-up with the right financial support, et cetera, of some of these enterprises. Analytical capacity, just to say that, again, there's no short-term solution to this, it seems to me. In the North today, for Elkind Rural Support Program, the entire leadership of the Elkind Rural Support Program is now from the North. But that's 40 years of HR investment, which today is very, very difficult to underwrite. It is taking people from the North, making sure they get the right education at home, making sure they get exposed to the best thinking in the world, and they go and do, I mean, we had for years a program with Guelph, where people from the North came and spent a year or 2 or 3 doing a graduate degree in rural development, going back. The combination of external knowledge and local contextual understanding is, I think, the key to this analytical capacity. But this is expensive. This is now HR investments of a very particular sort that I think need to be made over a long term, and we can see it paying off, but they have to be ready to be made.
Markus, do you have anything to add? We are running out.
Just briefly, I want to come back to this question of exporting programs that you raised. So, and Khalil just put it beautifully, which is it's music, not architecture. So the way I usually put it is most policymakers, not all, but most, are not morons, right? They're just, they don't take a program lock, stock, and barrel and say, oh yeah, this is what you did in Togo, I'm going to do it exactly the same in Mexico. Right? There's a lot of adaptation, and so when there's sense on the policy side, they make some music, right? And I think the disservice we do in academics, or not we, they, I'll take the distance here, is we sweep it under the rug, right? And we don't study that. So there was this fascinating study of these graduation programs across the world that was published in Science, which is the new holy grail for economists. And those programs were massively different. But that's not the way the article sounded, right? It's like, we did this, and it was the same. I mean, the components, the core components were the same. That's true. But the implementation, the targeting, everything was different. And they don't talk about that. In fact, they purposefully avoid that. And so I think that's where, when we try, so that'll get you published in a top journal, but when you're trying to make policy, understanding that process of adaptation and what factors went in, and the policymakers learning from each other about what they changed and why, that's missing, and that's bad.
It's unfortunate we have to bring this discussion to a close. Thank you so much for inspiring and rich discussion and for your excellent questions.